All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are diving deep into the mind of Elon Musk.
Yeah, no kidding. And he certainly didn't hold back in this 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson.
No, he did not.
hmm
We're going to be breaking down some of his most explosive takes on American politics.
And the future of democracy as we know it.
So, full disclosure, some of these claims might raise a few eyebrows.
To say the least, he actually predicts that the 2024 election could be America's last.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Last election. That's a pretty bold statement. What's the logic there?
Well, he lays out this whole scenario where he believes the Democratic Party is actively, intentionally using illegal immigration to try and solidify their power base.
Okay, so that's a pretty serious accusation. Does he back that up with anything concrete?
He does. He brings up some pretty startling statistics, actually, about illegal immigration increasing by, get this, triple digits.
Triple digits.
The
Yeah.
swing states in particular. And he claims this data is all from government websites. Even talks about this thing called the CVP Border app, which he says is this
The what?
the CVP Border app, which he says is like this secret program flying undocumented immigrants all across the country.
So he's suggesting this is all part of some master plan to influence election outcomes.
Essentially, yeah. And he goes on to say that once they're granted asylum, it's like a fast track to green cards and then citizenship.
Creating a whole voting bloc that
It's
favors.
to Democrats, right?
This ties into his whole argument about the Democrats creating dependency through social programs to.
Secure their votes, yeah. And California's, like his Exhibit A, he points to how they have this Democratic supermajority there.
Right, right. And he attributes that to this very strategy.
Yeah, he does. Now, the question is there actually evidence to back this up? Like, can we really draw a direct line from these policies to specific election results?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, there's no denying immigration affects demographics and voting patterns, but proving deliberate manipulation, that's a whole other ballgame.
It is. We'd really have to dig into independent studies and data to get a clearer picture.
Absolutely. But let's get back to some of the specific examples Musk uses. He talks about California's lack of voter ID laws.
Right. He finds it super hypocritical that you need a vaccine ID to travel but not to vote.
And he sees that as.
The way to rig elections. He calls it out as a blatant attempt at manipulation.
And then he brings up his own mother, who he says switched from Democrat to Republican after she got.
Punched in the face in New York City, yeah. Crazy story, right?
Wow. And he links that back to this broader trend he sees towards decriminalization of crime, particularly in places like California.
Which he says emboldens criminals and makes the streets less safe.
He seems especially fired up about those shoplifting laws. Right.
Oh, yeah. He basically says they've made it legal to steal anything under $1,000.
Which obviously is a big problem for
Small businesses, absolutely.
who can't afford the same level of security as these big corporations.
Exactly. So he paints this picture of a system that's failing to protect its citizens and instead is rewarding criminal behavior. Now, I know decriminalization is a hot topic.
It is, and there are valid arguments on both sides.
For sure. But before we get sidetracked, you mentioned earlier something about an F-client list. What's that all about?
Yeah, this is where things get even more intriguing.
And a little bit shady. He's referring to this supposed list of big-name individuals allegedly involved with Jeffrey Epstein.
Okay. And what does he say about it?
Well, he suggests that if Trump wins in 2024, this list is going to come out,
Wow.
and that there are some very powerful people, tech billionaires included, who are freaking out about that possibility.
Does he name any names?
He kind of implies that Reid Hoffman and Bill Gates might be on it, but
But no hard evidence.
nothing concrete. No, it's all speculation at this point.
Yeah.
But it definitely feeds into his larger concern about elites controlling the narrative and trying to shut down dissent.
Right, right. And then he goes on to say that Kamala Harris is basically a puppet controlled by,
1,000 puppet masters, yeah.
and that the Biden administration is going after X, formerly Twitter, with everything they've got.
Lawfare is the term he uses.
Right? Lawfare. Meaning,
He believes the government is weaponizing lawsuits to silence opposition and target his businesses.
he even mentions that DOJ lawsuit against SpaceX.
For not hiring asylum seekers, which he claims is impossible because of ITAR law.
So basically, he's alleging a pattern of politically motivated attacks.
Aimed at silencing him and his companies.
And this all ties back into his anxieties about what he calls activist judges.
Who he believes are eroding the justice system by prioritizing social justice over the actual law.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
I mean, he's presenting a pretty bleak outlook on American democracy and the forces he believes are trying to dismantle it.
Yeah, no sugarcoating here. And it's important to remember that these are highly controversial claims. We should definitely approach them with a critical eye.
For sure, there's a lot of debate to be had about the role of government, the limits of free speech, and the balance of power in our society.
Absolutely. We need to consider all sides of these complex issues.
So we've heard Elon's concerns, but does he offer any solutions? What does he think needs to change?
Well, freedom of speech is huge for him. Like, he sees it as absolutely fundamental to a healthy democracy.
And obviously, acquiring X was a big part of that.
Totally. He's been super vocal about his commitment to free speech on the platform.
But where's the line? Does he believe in completely unfettered expression? Or are there limits?
He's clear that X operates within the law, so they only censor content when specific countries legally require it.
Right.
But he also went a step further and actually open-sourced X's algorithm.
Really? Why do that?
Transparency. He believes in sunlight as the best disinfectant.
So by making the algorithm public,
He's basically inviting everyone to scrutinize it. And he's saying, look, there's no secret agenda here.
interesting. And he seems to believe that those pushing falsehoods really hate that kind of transparency.
Because it exposes their lies, right?
So he's putting his face in open dialogue, letting the marketplace of ideas sort things out.
Truth and open discourse, that's what he sees as the antidote to manipulation and propaganda.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not always so straightforward, is it? I mean, there's a lot of debate about the limits of free speech, especially with social media.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with how fast misinformation can spread.
Does he address that at all?
He does. He acknowledges how massive X is, with almost 600 million monthly active users.
Wow. Yeah.
He even compares regulating speech on X to, like, trying to control communication in a whole country.
Almost impossible.
Pretty much. So then the question becomes, how do we balance free speech with preventing actual harm?
Right. It's a tough one.
He seems to be banking on a combo of transparency, open dialogue, and those legal boundaries that are already in place.
Like Section 230, which prevents online platforms from being liable for user-generated content.
Exactly. And he's worried about what happens if that gets repealed.
Which he thinks is a real possibility if...
The Democrats stay in power. He believes they'll try to repeal it and make platforms like X liable for every single post.
Which would be...
Financially devastating, not just for X, but for pretty much every online platform.
Yeah. And he sees that as a way to silence dissenting voices, basically.
To control the narrative, yeah. He even says they'll try to shut down X by any means possible, including lawsuits, legislation, maybe even criminal charges.
Wow.
It's pretty serious stuff, but his concerns go beyond censorship, you know?
It's this bigger fear that America's losing its core values. Freedom, opportunity.
He sees a trend toward too much regulation, entitlement programs, and a decline in hard work and self-reliance.
So he's advocating for more individual responsibility, less government intervention.
Yeah, he thinks all that regulation stifles innovation and the entitlement programs just create dependency.
And of course, he brings up California's high-speed rail project.
The poster child for government inefficiency, according to him.
Right. He contrasts that with his own companies, SpaceX, Tesla.
Which embodies innovation, pushing the boundaries.
He wants us to get back to those core American values. Self-reliance, hard work, taking risks.
Absolutely. And this connects to his worries about birth rates, too, both in America and especially in Europe.
He sees that as a sign of...
Cultural stagnation, yeah. He believes a society needs young and old to thrive. And if birth rates keep falling, we're in trouble.
So not exactly a rosy picture he's painting.
No, but he does think the upcoming election could be a turning point.
He's putting his faith in the American people to choose a different path.
One that leads to freedom and opportunity. He urges people to really think critically and talk about these issues.
To reclaim those core values.
And ensure a future of progress and liberty.
So he's sounding the alarm, but he hasn't lost hope.
Not at all. He's presenting us with a choice. Now, there's one more really fascinating part of this interview we need to discuss.
Oh yeah, his take on empathy.
He makes some pretty bold statements about shallow empathy and how it's hurting us.
Okay, now this I gotta hear. Okay, so let's talk empathy. This is where things get really interesting with Elon.
Yeah, he really goes against the grain here. He even argues that certain types of empathy are actually harmful.
Right. He uses that phrase, shallow empathy. What exactly does he mean by that?
Basically, he's talking about what he sees as misplaced sympathy, particularly towards criminals instead of victims.
Okay.
And he believes that this kind of thinking can lead to policies that end up hurting everyone.
So instead of just reacting emotionally, he's saying we need to...
Think things through. Look at the consequences.
Right. Engage the brain.
Exactly. Consider the bigger picture, not just the immediate feelings.
And he ties this back to that whole decriminalization trend we discussed earlier.
Yeah, he sees it as a perfect example of this shallow empathy in action, where the focus shifts to the offender.
And the victim gets forgotten.
Exactly. He makes this pretty stark statement saying that people often have more empathy for a kidnapper than for the kidnapped child.
Wow, yeah, that's...
It's definitely provocative, but highlights his point. He wants us to re-examine our assumptions about empathy and how it shapes our justice system.
So it's not that he's against empathy altogether,
Not at all. He just thinks we need a more balanced approach.
where we hold people accountable while still recognizing that, people are complex.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between compassion and accountability.
Right. We can't let our emotions completely dictate our policies.
He even suggests that this shallow empathy can come from a place of privilege, people who live in these protected bubbles and haven't really faced the harsh realities of crime.
Which brings us back to his mom.
Right, and how her experience being assaulted totally changed her outlook.
It definitely makes his argument more personal, showing how real-life events can shape our views on these things.
It definitely does. And it makes us ask ourselves, are our good intentions actually making things better, or are we just reacting emotionally without considering the long-term effects?
That's a great question. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should we be thinking about after this deep dive?
Well, I think Elon is challenging us to go beyond surface-level feelings and have a more honest, more nuanced conversation about what it means to create a truly just and compassionate society.
A conversation that might be uncomfortable at times, but that can ultimately lead us to a better place.
Exactly. And isn't that what we're all about here? Pushing ourselves to think critically, challenge our own assumptions.
Absolutely. We've explored Elon Musk's unfiltered thoughts on everything from American politics to democracy to the very nature of empathy.
He certainly gave us a lot to think about, whether you agree with him or not.
He definitely did. And now it's your turn, listeners. Take these ideas, do your own research, form your own conclusions. Because in this world of information overload, critical thinking is more important than ever.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep those minds open.